Welcome to the New Hampshire Secrets, Legends, and Lore podcast, where twice a month we explore the world of New Hampshire that lies outside of the hard news. I'm your host, Wayne King, and I invite you to join us for an adventure that will take us on a journey together to explore those things that are unlikely to make the pages of your newspaper, the waves of your radio station, or the bits and bytes of your favorite news website. Yet for many of us, these stories will reveal what makes life here in the Granite State truly worth living. Together we'll uncover some secrets, speculate on a few rumors and legends, and we'll meet the people and a critter or two, both living and long departed, who weave together the colorful tapestry of New Hampshire's past, as well as some who are helping to build our future. We'll explore places known and unknown that you will want to add to your bucket list. We'll laugh together,
Well, I have three
gasp
daughters.
together,
They all live in New
and
Hampshire.
maybe even shed a tear or two.
I think I have 5 grandchildren. They all live in New Hampshire. I have 6 great-grandchildren. They all live in New Hampshire.
I first met Richard Dick Daschbach when I was a young state representative in New Hampshire. My colleague Michael Hutchings and I, who drove a car together to the legislature back and forth because we were both too broke to actually pay for gas for each of our cars, both became big admirers of Dick. He became, even though he was still a young man, he became sort of the mentor, gray head for Michael and I. We would have lunches with him in the cafeteria, sit with him whenever we could socially, and just talk about anything and everything. And the wisdom of his experiences, and to us at least, being in our 20s, his age, was really something to marvel at for us. In the last few years, I've caught up with Dick, who now lives in Exeter, New Hampshire. And he has had an incredibly interesting life. And I wanted to document that because he's one of these people who he's not a showboat. He's a quiet strength in any community that he chooses to involve himself with. Here's my interview with Judge Dick Daschbach.
Here I am, sitting
right.
down in my office, sitting in my chair.
Well, I'm speaking with my old friend Richard Daschbach. This is really great, Dick. How you been?
Well, I'll give you a short version of the story. 5 years ago, I had a series of TIAs, small strokes.
Yeah.
And I physically recovered pretty well, but emotionally, it really knocked me for a loop. And I have been seriously depressed ever since. And the depression is such that I have no energy and no willpower to do much about it. But although I'm now trying to do a bunch of silver sneakers exercises.
Huh.
So how about you? How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Yeah, I mean, Alice's passing and 2018 knocked me for a loop, and I,
Sure.
still am mourning her loss, but I don't think that will ever stop. So
No, you're right. I can clearly understand that.
Yeah.
Because my wife is absolutely my total savior right now.
yeah. Are you seeing a doctor for the depression issues, or what are you
Well,
doing?
I'll tell you what. I am a gross narcissist, and when I used to have a psychiatrist, and all I ever wanted to do was tell him stories and entertain him, and tell him, and that doesn't work. And these drugs they were selling me weren't worth a shit.
Oh,
So the answer is at the present time, no. And I quit going to them about 2 years ago because they weren't doing me any good.
right. Well, you still remember all those great stories, don't you? You just go and tell him stories.
Well, that's true. I mean, Wayne, I want to tell you, one of my problems is probably I had such a lucky, blessed life. So many good things happened to me. And then when I had the stroke, I just, I just I couldn't take it. I couldn't believe that had happened to me.
Yeah.
I mean, Virginia says to me, "You're angry." I'm not angry. I mean, I have been so unbelievably lucky. Something you probably don't know. In the year 2011, at age 74, I got the best job I ever had in my whole life. I was the chief judge of the Federal Workers' Compensation Appeals Board in the Department of Labor, and we moved to Washington, D.C. We were there for 4 years. It was the best paying job I ever had in my whole life. And thanks to Gene Shaheen.
Uh-huh.
Because Gene had appointed me to the New Hampshire Workers' Comp Board. And so I was listening to a lot of those appeals a few years before that. And Virginia and I were in Washington one Easter Sunday. And he said, "We should come back here in the wintertime." I said, "But I can't be a tourist. I got to get a job." And I looked for a job. I looked and I looked and I looked. I retired in 1994. I forgot. I was 54 when I got this appeals job. I had been retired for 20 years.
Wow.
And so that was why it was just an unbelievable pleasure. And we lived right on Capitol Hill. And I had a motor scooter and an electric bicycle. And I used to drive either of those down the Capitol Hill to the Department of Labor, which was at the bottom of Capitol Hill. It was wonderful.
Uh-huh. And when you decided that you'd look for a job, and then you eventually got the judgeship, did you contact Senator Shaheen's office and say you were looking for something? Did they happen to notice that it was available?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They were literally they were always there. What the good fortune I had was that the Deputy Secretary of Labor, who's responsible for filling this vacancy, he had worked for the Seafarers Union at the same time that I did. And so I knew him and he knew me, blah, blah, blah. And there in my resume, I had New Hampshire Workers' Comp Appeals. So I was really, quote, a natural, except, imagine somebody my age getting that job was pretty crazy. And the interesting thing is that the chief judge at that time was the guy from New Hampshire, whose name you may, Alec Cormelis.
Yeah, I know the name.
From Dover. Okay.
Yeah.
He was the chief. He was appointed by George Bush. He's had that job for, I don't know. Anyway, what happened was Gene Shaheen, Gene Shaheen really got me the job.
She went to
bat. I mean, I don't think
you.
she put, whenever something a little bit would happen, I'd hear some news, I'd call her office, and they would just, quote, follow up. They would just say, what's happening with that job? What's happening with that? And I'll tell you what, Wayne, a year or so after I got the job, when I was 75 years old, I ran in the 100 meters in the Penn relays in Franklin Field, Pennsylvania.
Wow.
Imagine running a 100-meter sprint.
At 75 years old.
Yeah, but I was last in the race. But nonetheless, I was in it.
Yeah, you're damn right. You were in
With
it.
40,000 people in the stands.
Wow.
It's pretty amazing. And I ran so badly, I couldn't figure out what the hell, why was my time so bad? Well, it was a year after the Boston Marathon. And so the security was very tight. And they said, report to the clerk of the track an hour before your event, which I did. And I went in the infield, and I never stopped warming up. So I left my race in the goddamn infield. But nonetheless. But I'll tell you what, Wayne, the reason I left, I only was there for 4 years. The reason is there were 2 Bush appointees still on the board, and they were both so anti-labor. It was unbelievable. And I tried to figure out a way to get them out of there. And I crafted this sword, to run through their belly. But they grabbed the sword and ran it through my belly. But, as a re-employed annuitant, you have no legal standing in the eyes of the federal government. But you know what? About 7 months after I came back to Washington, to New Hampshire, doctor said to me, "You've got prostate cancer." What? Yeah. Anyway, I got a treatment that worked. I had my testicles removed, and my PSA went to 0. But if I had stayed in Washington for another year, I'm sure I would not have gone to a urologist. And who knows what in the hell advanced my prostate cancer might have taken. Right, so as far as I'm concerned, losing that job and coming back to New Hampshire probably saved my life.
Yeah. Huh. Well,
anyway, I have a story.
How many years? You have another story?
I got a million stories.
Yeah, I know you got a million stories. I want to step back and kind of go through it chronologically. How many years were you in the legislature?
One term.
One term.
And the reason was, at the time that I was in the legislature, I was the assistant to the president of the Seafarers Union. And he died at 60 years of age. And when he died, my job died. And so I had to go back to really work. That's why I could not run for re-election.
Now, tell us what the Seafarers Union does.
Pardon?
Tell us about what the Seafarers Union does. What was your...
They represent the men and women who work on U.S. ships, ocean ships or river barges, or any kind of U.S. flag ship, of which there are not very many.
Private ships, right? Private ships.
Yeah. Container ships, tankers, river barges, like the Delta Queen or the Mississippi Queen.
Yeah.
I was assistant to the president for international affairs. I was traveled all over the world. I think I worked there for 6 years. I was really, to a large degree, simply a trophy behind the desk of the president of the union, because I had been the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission, appointed by Jimmy Carter.
And that was prior to you being in the legislature.
Oh, yeah. I got appointed by Jimmy Carter to be the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission in 1977. And I was there for one term. Reagan became president, and I wrote a letter to Reagan saying, I did not wish to be considered for reappointment. And so my friend says, what the hell are you doing? What do you think you're kidding? I said, I'm not kidding, but I got the jump on him. I said, don't reappoint me, before he said, you're not reappointed. Anyway, after that job, that's when I went to work for the Seafarers Union. And as I said, I think I was kind of like a trophy behind the desk of the president. I was a big tuna fish. But in any event, it was a wonderful job. And for 6 years, I traveled all over the world, and I took my wife with me, took my children with me. I took one of my daughters to Hong Kong, and after 6 years, I I get a pension from that union.
Wow.
I get over $1,000 a month from that seafarers union. Ever since I was 65 years old. So that's over 20 years of $13,000 a year.
Huh.
Not bad. That's what I mean about being lucky.
Yeah. So right after you left the legislature,
Right.
then what did you do?
Well, I went back to my office, to my job. When I was in the legislature, I had a desk and a secretary in Washington, D.C.
Oh, okay.
And so I just went back to work.
Uh-huh. Until he died.
Pardon?
Until your boss died.
No, when he died, I had to go back to work.
Oh, okay.
Because the new president said, come on, man, because I was on the cusp of the AFL-CIO was starting to focus on state legislatures, and I wanted to go to the president of the new president and said, "Hey, Mike, I got a great idea. I'm a member of the New Hampshire legislature, and I'm working for you, and let me concentrate my work on what Lane Kirkland, the president of the AFL-CIO, wants to do with state legislatures." And he said, "Man, we can't afford you." I was the highest paid non-elected official of the union. And I had a tremendous expense account because I was always flying to London and Geneva. So I left the legislature. I was actually on the ballot in 1988. And I said, people, don't vote for me because I can't serve. I've got to go back to work, which I did. And they took me at my word, and they whooped me. I would have been happy if I'd only lost by one vote. Anyway, I left there and went back to work went back to my job at the union. And unfortunately, that didn't last very long because the new president said, "This isn't going to work. You're too expensive." The guy who died, imagine listening to this, the guy who died put his name up in the front of the building, named the building after himself while he's still living. And the new president said, "Man, we're broke. We have to sell this building," which they didn't do. He just retired last week.
Wow.
Anyway, it's not a very large union. And I learned a lot working for him, and I enjoyed life a lot. I went all over the place.
Well, when you traveled to these different places, obviously it was for some kind of official work conferences and that kind of thing.
Oh yeah. We were working on creating international agreements. We were trying to raise the work standards of seafarers all over the world, so that the U.S. ships would be more competitive.
So, can you give me an example of why we weren't competitive?
Because I'll tell you what, most tankers bringing oil to the United States are U.S. owned, but not U.S. crewed, not U.S. flag, registered in foreign countries, and getting the cheapest labor on earth. That's the reason we're not competitive is because of wages of sailors. That's all. That's the principal reason.
So it would be a U.S. boat, but the crews would all be low-paid foreign workers. Is that
exactly?
And were you trying to require that they have U.S. crews or a portion?
No, what we were trying to do was raise the standards of work, of pay worldwide so that we would be more competitive. Now, you just touched on an interesting topic when you said required to carry a U.S. flag. When I worked before the Carter administration, and I worked for the Senate, U.S. Senate, I was the Maritime Council. I worked on a piece of legislation in the 70s that finally passed in 1975. And it would have required 20% of the oil imported into the United States come on U.S. flag ships, U.S. crude, U.S. flag. And very controversial legislation, very controversial. And we squeaked by. It was essentially labor against capital. And 60 Minutes did a nasty piece against the union, working on that legislation. It finally passed, and it was very controversial as to whether President Ford was going to sign it, which unfortunately he pocket vetoed it New Year's Eve, 1975. And the president of the Seafarers Union said, he told me he would sign. He stabbed me in the back. And the AFL-CIO did not intend to support Carter or Ford for president. And he said that Ford stabbed me in the back. We've got to support Carter. And if you recall how close that election was, imagine this. Labor might have just, you could claim Labor did it.
Uh-huh.
And then 5 months after Carter got elected president, he appointed me the head of a federal agency called the Federal Maritime Commission.
Uh-huh.
So, all these things work their way. Things work.
Now, this is a civics moment for us here. Dick, explain to people what a pocket veto is.
Well, a pocket veto is when a bill gets passed by the Congress and gets sent to the White House for the president's action. If he doesn't sign it within, I don't know how many days, maybe 20 days or something like that. If he fails to sign it, it's called a pocket veto.
Right. So he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to actually be official about vetoing it.
He doesn't have to write no. He just keeps his mouth shut, and that causes it to collapse.
And does Congress get an override vote on a pocket veto or not?
I can't honestly remember. I would think so. I would think so. But I guarantee you we couldn't have overridden it because we passed it in the Senate by just 2 or 3 votes. In fact, there also is a great story. Russell Long of Louisiana, for whom I worked, because as you may know, I grew up in New Orleans. He was the manager of that bill. And the principal opponent of that bill was Norris Cotton of New Hampshire. And here I was a New Hampshire resident working in the U.S. Senate for a Louisiana senator. And I'm trying to remember now where I'm going here. Can't remember where I know what. When we knew the conference report was going to be voted on in the Senate, the lobbyists for the Seafarers Union and I, on a Saturday, called every single senator's office on Saturday to make sure they were going to be there and vote for us, the ones that were going to vote for us. And so when Monday came along, in the middle of the day, I decided to go over to the Senate chamber to go to the recorder's office and to look at a big tally sheet of an earlier vote. And I saw that 3 or 4 of our senators who on Saturday, their office said they'd be there, and on Monday they weren't there. And so we then covered our absentees with a live pair. And what a live pair means is a senator who knows he's going to be there, he goes to another senator he knows is voting opposite him. And if they're going to be friendly with each other, the guy who's going to be there, when his name gets called, he says, I have a live pair with Senator Hathaway of Maine, And if he were president and voting, he would vote yes. And if I were voting, I would vote no. Since I have a live pair with him, I withhold my vote. And that was the margin of victory for us. And interestingly, Bill Hathaway was one of those senators. His mother had died that weekend, and so that's why he wasn't there. But anyway, the margin was so close that an override would have never happened.
Huh. So you worked
for big oil against labor.
You worked for Russell Long, the legendary Russell Long, for whom one of the buildings is in the Senate. The Senate isn't the Senate office building named for Russell Long?
No. He's naming it for Richard Russell.
Oh, okay.
I can't imagine. I can't believe why it's still named the Russell office building. Because when John McCain died, there was a little story floated around that they were going to change the name of the building from the Russell building to the McCain building, but they didn't do that. Russell Long was Huey Long's son.
Oh, okay. But he really was a legendary figure in the Senate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
You got any good stories about him?
Oh man, I'm telling you, there are a million of them. He became chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. I mean, he was a brilliant man. He was 18 years old when his father was Huey Long was assassinated. And Russell Long then went to LSU to college, and he became president of the student body. So he was winning elections, at age 19 or whatever.
Huh.
And he was in the Senate till he was almost 80. Right. As a matter of fact, he won the election in Louisiana before he was legally old enough, and he couldn't take the oath of office immediately. He had to wait till he was I think you have to be 30 to be a senator.
Yes.
I lose, all these details. My brain still works very well.
Yeah.
But they get a little mixed up every now and then.
Well, what was he like as a person?
Well, he was a very strange character. He was a nice man, but he socially he had a crazy ass personality. Crazy.
Like his old man, you mean? I mean, Huey was pretty outrageous.
Oh yeah, well, here this kid is a teenager, and the governor's mansion is being surrounded by the National Guard to protect him and all that kind of bullshit. You can imagine what kind of a twisted up kid you'd turn out to be.
Yeah. Huh.
But working for him was a miracle. I still have a letter, Wayne. When I graduated from college and was engaged to get married and was planning to go to law school, I needed a job. And I was living in New Orleans in a college dormitory, which I wasn't going to that college. And I wrote a letter to Russell Long's administrative assistant, whom I thought this man worked for Russell Long. I wasn't 100% sure, because his son was a year behind me in grade school. And I got a job working in the Senate post office, making, in 1958, $4,612 a year, less than $100 a week, working in the Senate post office. And I was a law student.
Huh.
So that's how I started, right then and there.
Wow.
And that last job that I had as the chief judge of the Workers' Comp Appeals Board, I was making $176,000 a year. I started out at $4,600.
That's quite a spread over a lifetime, but
yeah, it's quite a long spread.
Yeah. And
but you're right, quite a spread.
When you were working for Long, how'd you get the job with Long anyway?
Because the man whose son was a year behind me in grade school. First of all, I had a patronage job working in the Senate post office, which was, kind of a crazy job. You worked a half a day because I was a day student in law school. And I was there for a year and a half, and I was doing a scrapbook for Russell Long, keeping a scrapbook of newspaper clippings. So they got to know me in his office. And remember, well, you probably wouldn't know, you never heard of it, but there was a guy who was on the U.S. Davis Cup tennis team named Hamilton Richardson. He worked for Russell Long.
Yep.
Okay, Ham Richardson was his name. He quit to go to work for Smith Barney, and the same administrative assistant guy called me on the phone or left it. There was a card on a note on my time card in the post office. Call Bob Hunter. I called Bob, and he said, "We want you to come work in the office." And guess what? My first child was born that same day.
Ah,
It was the last. It was the last day of class of my first semester in law school. And so 2 weeks later, I was working in Long's office.
wow. And what, boy, is that a day that was lucky in your life, huh?
Oh, yeah, man, I have been so lucky so many times. In fact, now that, as I told you, I'm filled with stories. My wife was pregnant with our second child when I was a second year law student. And I walked out of the Senate office building, and I saw all these cars over on the side street. And I looked, and they were making a movie. And so I walked over there to look to see what was going on. And I saw a guy with whom I had a part-time job loading the theater, the live theater in Washington, D.C. He says, "Hey, man, we're working for Otto Preminger, who was making the movie. We're driving cars. We're driving their people. You want a job?" And I said, "Yeah, the Senate is going to adjourn sine die in a couple of days, and I'll be able to do that." And so I worked for, I think it was 3 weeks, and I made just enough money to pay the obstetrician to deliver my second daughter.
On an Otto Preminger movie.
They were making Advise and Consent.
And that was the name of the movie, Advise and Consent?
Yeah. Remember that book, Advise and Consent?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was it.
Wow.
Huh. As I said, I had a million stories.
So were you driving actors and actresses around?
Yeah.
Or?
I remember driving Peter Lawford. There was a big party at Bobby Kennedy's house, and I was sitting there with all these black chauffeurs, waiting for these people in the parties. And I'll tell you another little tiny thing that happened. Because I was doing this, and what I would have to do is, in the morning, I would have to drive to a hotel where the movie crew was staying, and I would get this car, and I would do whatever the hell they told me to do. And so I decided, well, shit, I'm going to skip going to law school class while I have this job. And so I skipped the first 3 weeks of law school. And I remember the last day of that semester, this professor says, "And don't forget to read that Harvard Law Journal article on evidence." And I said to this kid next to me, "What's he talking about?" He said, "Oh, I don't know, some Law Journal article," which I didn't read. And so the final exam for that course was 2 questions. One was whatever the heck it was, and the other one was, talk about this Law Journal article, which I had not read. And I said, I can't even put the pen to the paper. I don't know anything. And so while I was supposed to be taking the exam, I went downstairs and registered for night school because I was going to be changing jobs, from the post office to the Sayers office. Anyway, I did that. And the woman says, and I said, "Oh, by the way, put me down for such and such." "Well, you should be, what are you doing here? The exam is going on right now." I said, "Well, I'm going to flunk it, I'm sure." Anyway, I went to see the professor, and I went to tell him the story about working for the movie and about my daughter and all this stuff. And he said to me, "What would you do if we were in opposite chairs?" And I was the professor, and he was the student. I said, "I got to call him the way I see him." And he said, "Yep, that's my answer." But you know what? Instead of giving me a 50, he gave me a 70 or 69, which allowed me to take the exam over again and not have to repeat the course.
Oh.
And I made it.
Huh. This time you read the law review article?
No, well, the interesting thing about that was the exam that I had to take it over again.
Yeah.
The exam was written by another professor.
Uh-huh.
It was a different, a different class. And I don't think I don't know if I read the article or not.
Now,
Probably not.
where were you going to law school, Dick?
Georgetown.
Georgetown. Wow.
Yeah.
That's
in
impressive.
Washington, D.C.
And did you get to meet Bobby Kennedy?
Well, I'm sure I said hello to him a few times.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because he used to walk. He was when I worked in the Senate Post Office. He was working for the McClellan Committee that was doing the Teamsters hearing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Bobby Kennedy would be walking around the hallways with his shirt sleeves, with his shirt rolled up,
Yeah.
the shirt sleeves rolled up, walking like he's going to be in a fight. He was a tough guy.
He brought as I recall, he brought his dogs to work pretty regularly. But they were probably in his office. Bob Reich tells this great story about how his first job in Washington was running the signature machine for Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah. You know, that machine was called an auto pen. AUTOPEN. Auto pen. Well,
he said he used to write phony letters to his friends that were then signed by Bobby Kennedy. Congratulations on having the largest nose in Washington, D.C. That kind of thing. Yeah. And
I remember Reich. In fact, when we were in the legislature, I remember Reich campaigning for Dukakis. Was I in the legislature then? I can't remember. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was for Gephardt. I was a delegate to that convention. I was a delegate to the convention in Atlanta.
For Dukakis.
Well, no, I was really a Gephardt delegate. And I remember Chris Spear. And I remember Chris Spear saying to me, "When are you going to get on the team?" And finally, when Gephardt said, "Okay, you can go now," I voted for Dukakis. Remember that? That was a speech Dukakis wrote that he gave on. He went on and on and on and on.
Yeah. Oh man, Chris Spiro was kind of a colorful character. Did you know him pretty well?
Well, fairly well. How about you? Do you know him well?
I did. He and I butted heads right from the very beginning because
I was going to say you two guys were not. Chris was quote always one step ahead of the sheriff.
Yeah,
that's what people used to say.
And
you're right. He was really a character. And remember when we were in the legislature, Ray Buckley was so tight with Mary Chambers. I used to say if Mary Chambers ever stopped short, Ray Buckley would bust his nose hitting her in the behind. I remember you and Arnie and I used to sit on those on that camera platform in the back of the chamber.
Oh yeah.
They built a TV camera platform.
Right, and we'd make fun of all the things that were going on. You remember there was a woman. It wasn't Edna Pearl Parr, although I certainly remember Edna Pearl. But there was, I think her name was Walters, a woman who came to the legislature every day that we were going to be in session, wearing a red shirt and a green jacket, or a green shirt and a red jacket.
Right.
And it was her job, if the leadership of the Republican Party wanted you to vote yes, she would take off her green jacket. Take off her red jacket and parade around in her green shirt, and that was the signal.
I didn't know. I wasn't aware of that.
That was a signal to all the people who weren't paying attention to anything else about how they had to vote.
Right. You know how I got in the legislature? I ran in, I forget what year it was, and I lost by a very, very slim margin. And the two ladies in my district were a woman named Helen Burley and Joanne Morse. And nobody seemed to like them. And I was going door to door. And the more people I would go, they said, who are you running against? And I'd say, oh, well, you got it, don't worry. So I think I was a bit overconfident. And I lost by a very small margin. And so I was working for the Seafarers then, traveling by train from Springfield, Mass. To Washington every Monday and every Thursday back. Anyway, the guy I was living with in Washington, I used to constantly talk about losing the legislature by only a handful of votes. And he said to me, how many people vote in the primary? I said, not very many. He says, why don't you run in the primary for Republican write-in votes? And Helen Burley was very unpopular. And so I literally did that. I was a Democrat. I was on the Democratic ballot. Right. And then I went door to door to the Republicans and saying, you have an option. You have a choice. You could vote for me. And I had cards, which were write-in cards.
Yeah.
And shamelessly, I had twin granddaughters who were less than a year old. And I had this big playpen fence out in front of the town hall in Chesterfield, which was the biggest town in the district, with a big sign, vote for our grandpa. And Helen Burley was hanging out in front of the town hall, bragging about how much money Jack Kemp was giving her. And I remember thinking to myself, lady, you better save that money, and you and your husband can fly to Florida because you're going to lose. And sure enough, the next morning, she didn't wait around to watch the vote count, because she was confident. She called the town clerk, who didn't like her, and she said, how did I do? What was the score? She says, you lost. What? And she wrote letters to the Keene newspaper saying, this guy Daschbach, he's a labor union lawyer. He shouldn't be doing this. But anyway, and the legislature, they passed, I don't know which legislature, but Bill Gardner told me that's the first time in history anyone has beaten the other person off of their ticket in the primary.
Yeah.
And so after that, the legislature passed a bill that said, you can't do that. You can't be a nominee of Party A and then run for write-ins on Party B.
Uh-huh.
You can get nominated, but you can't do it in a contested election.
Right. You're right. I recall.
But I did it.
I recall something being done, but I did something similar to that when I ran. My theory was not when I ran for the Senate. My theory was not that I could win the Republican primary, but that it would be a whole lot easier for people to vote for me in the for Republicans to vote for me in the general election if they had written me in the primary. So I think I was just, I don't know why, but I was just reviewing an article about the results of that first election the other day. And I think I got something like 1,000 Republican write-ins.
Wow.
For the state Senate seat.
Yeah.
And that's when I won by more than 1,000 votes. So.
Wow. I mean, speaking of winning by 1,000 votes, imagine Maggie Hassan 6 years ago winning by a little bit more than 1,000 votes, and 6 years later winning by 1 million votes.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
They really ran a smart campaign.
Yes. Yeah. And she was lucky. If New Hampshire had ranked choice voting, Bolduc wouldn't have won the primary, and she would have been up against Chuck Morse, who would have been much more formidable opponent.
Well, she was also damn lucky that that Chris Sununu chose not to run against her.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that would have been a different outcome.
Yeah.
That's why I said to you the other day, I don't think Sununu is serious about this presidential run. I think this is a broader scheme to defeat Trump, to have Trump lose the New Hampshire primary.
Yeah.
and lose after that.
Well, if there's a big field, first of all, I don't think we're going to have the first in the nation primary, but we'll be up front somewhere.
Oh yeah. We'll be the first week anyway.
Yeah,
For the
and
first,
but when you have a whole lot of candidates, somebody can actually win the New Hampshire primary with 15-16% of the vote.
yeah, right, exactly.
It's crazy.
Well,
It's
with Nikki Haley in there and Pence and DeSantis, that guy DeSantis, he's worse than Trump.
yeah, yeah.
I read an article today out of the Washington Monthly magazine about what he's doing with a private university in Florida, changing the whole board of governors. In fact, I'll send you a copy of it.
Okay.
Incredible.
Now you were okay. So, what was home for you when you were a kid?
When I was what?
When you were a kid, where did you grow up?
New Orleans.
In New Orleans.
Right.
So that's how you got tied into New Orleans. And
exactly.
how did you end up coming to New Hampshire?
Well, what happened was when I was in New Orleans, my father's job changed to Baltimore County, Maryland. I had just finished my second year of Loyola in New Orleans, and I transferred to Georgetown when I was a junior. And to answer your question, one summer when I was working in Washington, I had 3 children. We came to New Hampshire. We came leaf peeping, and on our way home from leaf peeping, we went to see some friends of ours who grew up in Washington, who lived in Keene, New Hampshire.
Uh-huh.
We went to Keene, and the lady said, "You ought to go take a look at Lake Spofford. You might want to rent a cottage there this summer for your vacation." So in 1967, we rented a cottage on Lake Spofford for a month. We pulled a Lightning sailboat with us behind our car, a 19-foot sailboat. And I thought, why in the hell are people beating their brains out in Washington, D.C., and New York and Philadelphia when they could live in a place like this year round? And so I had to go back to work the third week of that month. And I went to talk to a couple of people looking for a job. And the one thing I was saying then was, I don't want to work for the government and I don't want to be a lawyer. And so what happened? I ended up becoming the OEO poverty lawyer in Keene, New Hampshire. And so my wife was in Spofford getting these letters that letters of recommendation that people are writing for me. Well, I'm living in Washington looking for a job in New Hampshire, and I got it. But we only stayed 2 years. Hale Boggs, a former congressman from New Orleans, who died in a plane crash that disappeared in Alaska.
Right.
He came to Walpole, where we live, delivering his grandson to his son, Tommy Boggs, the big lobbyist in Washington. Right. And he offered me a job. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I'm happy here and I need to stay here. And anyway, Tommy Boggs' wife, whom I knew in New Orleans when I was in high school, talked me into taking the job. As it turned out, my wife and kids went to Washington early in September because school was starting. And I was supposed to go work for the Joint Economic Committee for Hale Boggs. And so I went to Washington for a weekend, and I went to see the staff director of the Joint Economic Committee. And he said to me, "I don't know what Mr. Boggs wants you to do. I see you have never taken a course in economics for a day in college. I don't know what he wants you to do, and I also don't know where you're going to sit." And I thought to myself, with a welcome like that, I walked across the street to Long's office, who had just become chairman of the Merchant Marine Subcommittee of the Commerce Committee. and he was entitled to hire somebody for the committee. And so I had to wait for my friend who had helped me earlier when I was a law student. He always went to the World Series. I had to wait for the World Series to be over to talk with him. And I said to him, "Hey, I'd like to come work for the committee for Russell Long." And so that's what happened. But while we were, and then, okay, that was after we decided to move to New Hampshire. But you know what? When we moved to New Hampshire and lived in Walpole, and I was the legal services lawyer, when we went back to Washington, I said, "Okay, we'll do it under one condition. We will keep our house in Walpole, and I will retire from the federal government as soon as I can." Because at that point in time, I had about 5 or 6 years experience, and I could smell retirement coming. And so that's how we got here and stayed here forever.
Huh. So
it's been a wonderful ride, Wayne. In fact, that quotation you gave at Alice's memorial service from what's his name, Johnson, about it's been a hell of a ride.
Oh yeah. Hunter Thompson.
Yeah, Hunter Thompson. A cousin of mine sent me that about a month ago, and I said, "That is my new mantra." I totally agree with.
Yeah,
and I have had a hell of a ride.
Yes, you have. Yes, you have, my friend.
Yeah,
and we haven't even really touched on many of the stories. But did you have other jobs during that period after the legislature and before being a judge that were particularly memorable?
Yeah, well, I worked for the union for 6 years. And at that point in time, I was the maritime counsel in the Senate for 10 years. And then I got appointed chairman of the Maritime Commission. Then I went to work for the union after Reagan became president. And when the president of the union died, and I had no job, and my youngest daughter just starting college, I needed 1 more year to retire. And so I went to work for the House Merchant Marine Committee. And I'm trying to remember if there were any New Hampshire connections there. Chuck Douglas's office was right next to my office when I worked for the House Merchant Marine Committee.
Wow.
And so after that, I only needed 1 year, but I stayed 2. And I retired in well, let's see. I guess it was 1994. I retired from the federal government. And we came back to New Hampshire. And I did all this crapping around for 20 years. And then I got the job at the Department of Labor. Crazy, huh?
Yeah. So did you know Chuck well?
Well, yeah, I used to see him all the time. Yeah. But
he was
kind of
he had a good sense of humor.
Yeah, he did. He was a very friendly guy, very friendly.
Yeah. I'll never forget him when I was my first term in the legislature. I went to something where he was the keynote speaker, and he was at the time on the New Hampshire Supreme Court.
Supreme Court, right?
Yeah, and he told this story about that was kind of a self-effacing story. He said this fella called the he called this. He needed a car for something, and he called the state's general services office to find out about getting a state car for the day. And the guy who was who answered the call said, "Well, we got this car and that car, all these modest cars." And he said, "And then we got one of those limousines that those fat ass judges drive around in." And Chuck said, "Do you know who you're talking to?" And he said no, and he said, well, this is Justice Chuck Douglas. And there's this long pause, and the guy says, do you know who you're talking to? And Chuck says, no. And he said, well, I'll see you later, fat ass.
He just said, well, I'm skinny as Chuck Douglas. Yeah. Yeah. Did you know my cousin Joe Daschbach was a lawyer in Hanover and Lebanon?
I knew his name, but I never knew him.
Well, he was a wonderful guy. Talk about a nice guy. He died of prostate cancer.
Now, did he grow up down in New Orleans as well? And
No. The Daschbachs were from Pittsburgh. He grew up in Pittsburgh. Went to Notre Dame.
Pittsburgh, PA, or Pittsburgh, New Hampshire?
Pittsburgh, PA.
Okay.
Yeah, and he went to Notre Dame, and he went to Georgetown Law School about 5 years after I got out, because he was in the Navy when he got out of college. But he was a great guy. I saw one of his daughters and his widow a couple of weeks ago. No, right after Christmas, and they said at Dartmouth he was known as "Let Him Go Joe." He was a municipal judge in Hanover, and if Dartmouth students who had to go to court for an obvious reason, Joe would let them off, and so he let him go Joe.
Let him go Joe.
Yeah.
Wow.
Hey, Wayne, I want to ask you a question.
Shoot.
That picture on the internet with you in a yellow shirt, how old is that picture?
3 years.
That's all?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've gone downhill fast.
Well, the yellow you just need to wear the yellow shirt. That's all. That'll do the job for you.
Okay. That's what I'll do. I'll go find a few.
You moved out of Rumney, right?
Yeah. We had this wonderful house beside Stinson Brook. In fact, the year before we built the house, Alice and I got married in a little civil ceremony, just 4 of us. Mike Hutchings, Debbie Butler, Susan Caligari, and Alice and I. And then we built the house. I'd lived there for 35 years, and Alice got sick, and we were her illness was very trying on the finances, needless to say. After she died, not only could I, the house was too big for me anyway, but I couldn't afford to stay there. And so I sold it and moved into a condominium in Thornton. And within about 2 months, I realized that I had made a huge mistake to get into a condominium, because condominium living was not for a freedom-loving guy like me. I don't like somebody saying you can't have that on your porch, and and you have to do this and you have to do that. So I in June of this year, I found out that the value of my condo had doubled, and I immediately put it on the market, sold it in 2 days, and bought this little Sears and Roebuck bungalow up on the side of the Connecticut River in the town of Bath.
Wow.
About an hour north of Hanover.
Well, that's a nice story.
Yeah. So
that's a happy story. You deserve the happy story.
Yeah. Alice would have loved it here. It's a nice little spot. You can sit out on the porch in the summertime, and the bald eagles fly right along the Connecticut River byway there, and it's very nice, very nice.
Speaking of condos, we live in Exeter, New Hampshire, which is a wonderful little town.
Yeah,
wonderful. And we bought a condo here in 2006, and two of our daughters have been living here since 2008, and for in the last 3 weeks, Virginia and I moved from an apartment into the condo with our two daughters.
Uh-huh.
It's a converted barn with a lot of exposed beams, and it's a beautiful place.
Nice.
And so I'm very happy here.
Now, a few years ago when I talked with you, you were living in some other kind of unique place. I think it was in Exeter as well.
No, I think when you ran for governor, we lived in Westmoreland.
Right. I remember that. Yeah. But
in a very, very old salt box.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when we sold that to Jim Donch's brother-in-law, and Virginia designed and built a house on the same property.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, this the house where we live now is pretty wonderful. But I'm living with a 61-year-old and a 55-year-old daughter.
Uh-huh.
But it's okay. It's working out. As
Good.
I'm saying, it's my potential assisted living.
Right.
With staff.
Yeah. You got good family support. That's
you bet. That's where I'm really lucky. I have 3 daughters. They all live in New Hampshire. I think I have 5 grandchildren. They all live in New Hampshire. I have 6 great grandchildren. They all live in New Hampshire.
Wow. So they all decided that this was where they wanted their spot on the porch to be.
Oh yeah. Now this condo, you're right about what you can hang on your porch, because you can't hang a political poster in a window that it can be seen from at least if you're following the rules.
Right.
But ours is we're only a 4-unit condo, and so but I don't try to put any pictures on the wall.
Yeah.
Or posters.
Right. Yep.
Anyway.
Well, I'm so glad that we had the chance to talk, my friend.
Well, this is a unique way of talking to a friend.
Yeah, it is. But I hope that I'll turn it into a little wit and wisdom of Dick Daschbach podcast at some point.
Yeah, for a narcissist, that's a dream come true. Maybe someday I'll come right up to Bath and check you out.
Yeah, I'll be down on the seacoast sometime, probably in May. A friend of mine, Genevieve Achel, is going to be doing her last production at the theater, one of the theaters in. Oh my gosh, I'm embarrassed that I can't remember the name of the theater, but it's in Portsmouth. Yeah.
You know, you mentioned the name Debbie Butler. That's a familiar name.
Oh yeah, she was the treasurer of the state Democratic Party for a number of years. Wonderful person. She's a Democratic activist, and still.
I don't know why her name is familiar to me.
Yeah.
And what was the other person's name?
Susan Caligari. She worked for Gary Hart.
Oh yeah. Okay, I remember now.
Yeah. She's a terrific lady. And
well, I tell you what, Wayne, I've got a lot of I have some great photos to share with you, which I'll send to you. I'll email to you.
Oh, excellent! I'd love that.
Yeah.
Dick Daschbach, great to talk with you, my friend, and let's do this again in a month or two.
Yeah, whenever you want. You know, I'm not very shy. I'm happy to do it. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. As I've said to you, I remember our great times in Indianapolis.
Yeah, that's right. That was a good time.
Yeah, we hung out together.
Yeah, we did. We did.
I'm trying to remember the name of that state legislator woman who was a hairdresser.
Huh.
And I remember having dinner with her one night. Anyway.
Was she from New Hampshire, you mean?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, she was in the legislature.
No.
I'll think of it. I'll let you know.
All right. Good talking to
Thank
you,
you.
my friend.
This was great fun.
Yeah, it was.
I enjoyed talking with you. And at the same time, I can look at my own face.
Okay, buddy. You take care.
Okay. Thank you, Wayne. Bye-bye.